It is the night of July the 3rd, 1947, New Mexico. A violent storm hits Roswell, a secluded New Mexico citadel of 27,000 inhabitants, mostly ranchers and soldiers from the nearby RAAF military base, the Roswell Army Airfield. Two Catholic nuns have just started their night shift at the Santa Maria Hospital. Dan Wilmot, a local farmer, is sitting on his porch when his wife orders him to come back into the house. A professor of archaeology and some of his students, searching for Native American artifacts, are sleeping in their tents a short distance west of Roswell, along the northern slope of the Capitan Mountains. The RAAF radar operators notice an unidentified flying object, performing maneuvers that cannot be associated with military maneuvers. It continually reverses course, swerves swiftly and abruptly, rises and falls at ultra-high speeds. The military believes this is caused by equipment failure, but decides to keep the mysterious object under observation. Until, at 11:27 p.m, the object disappears from the radar screen. The two nuns head towards the windows on the third floor of the hospital, intrigued by an intense glow. Through the glass they see a bright, fiery object heading at very high speed towards the mountains north of Roswell, which then disappears behind the peaks. At the same time, Dan Wilmot and his wife also see a bright flash in the sky, much more like a flying object than a simple lightning bolt. The archaeologist and his students look up and observe the same flying, luminous object passing over their heads. A few moments later, a loud explosion echoes through the sky. It cannot be thunder. It is an explosion, the sound of a strange flying object crashing. Thus begins the mysterious, controversial, and fascinating story of the Roswell incident. The crash occurs not far from the camp where the archaeologist and his students are sleeping. Due to the storm, they decide to go to the site of the incident at the first light of dawn. The professor, convinced that the object is a crashed plane, tells two of his students to go and find the nearest telephone to call for help. Shortly after midnight, the two students locate a phone on Highway 380 and call the Roswell Sheriff George A. Wilcox to inform him that they have witnessed a plane crash. But is it really a plane crash? Sheriff Wilcox informs the Roswell Fire Department. A fire engine answers the call and, escorted by a police car, travels about 55 miles along Highway 246 and then heads down a dirt road near the Capitan Mountains to the crash site. On board the fire engine is 42-year-old Tennessee-born Lieutenant Dan Dwyer, who moved to New Mexico after the Second World War, where he met and then married his wife Minnie. Dan too saw an extremely bright flash of light. Driven by curiosity, he doesn't hesitate for a moment when called to investigate the incident with his colleagues. The fire engine and police officers arrive a few kilometers from the scene of the accident. There are still a few hours until dawn. After passing the Capitan Mountains, they are forced to stop. A small convoy of soldiers and some members of the government are patrolling the area and have orders to stop anyone who tries to approach the crash site. In fact, After the mysterious object disappeared from the radar, the RAAF soldiers immediately headed to the site of the impact. Dan and his colleagues asked to be able to intervene in case there are any injured people, but the military are firm in their positions. No civilian or member of the police can approach the impact area. What is so important to prevent firefighters from simply doing their job? Lieutenant Dwyer certainly just can't sit there doing nothing and decides to act. He asks one of his subordinates to offer hot coffee from their thermoses to the military. Taking advantage of this moment, when the tension is lower and dawn still hasn't broken, he slips away unnoticed. He climbs through the rocks, goes through the trees, and reaches a point where he can see a huge number of army personnel, projector lights blaring, jeeps and military vans, radio and communication systems. Not only that, Dan also notices a strange aircraft being lifted into the air by a crane, being placed onto a flatbed truck. The aircraft is secured with chains and cables and then covered with a tarp. At that moment, a group of people approaches the site. It is the archaeologist with his students. Lieutenant Dwyer returns to the fire engine, shaken by what he has just seen. With an excuse, he avoids the insistent questioning by the military. A few hours pass, and the site is completely cleared and made safe by the army. No trace of the mysterious flying object. No information about the crash. Lieutenant Dwyer is the only eyewitness to an unsolved mystery. He is tormented by his thoughts. Who can he tell about what he saw? Why all that secrecy? What was the strange aircraft taken away by the military? Meanwhile, the members of the RAAF are convinced that they have collected all the information and evidence and contained all the news regarding the unusual nature of the incident. But is that really the case? After the violent thunderstorm that struck County Roswell on the night between Thursday the 3rd and Friday the 4th of July 1947, the rancher William McBrazel goes about his usual morning routine, oblivious both to what happened while he slept blissfully and that which will await him. He mounts his horse and inspects the pastures surrounding his ranch. With him is his neighbour's young son, Timothy, aged 7. During his inspection, Brazel discovers a large pile of debris: metal, plastic-like beams, pieces of light material, foil and string. Brazel takes away some fragments of the scattered material and returns to his neighbour's house. In particular, he shows Floyd and Loretta, little Timothy's parents, a rather curious object. A strange sheet of what at first glance appears to be aluminium, very flexible, yet which cannot be burned or cut. Moreover, when they try to crumple it, it returns to its original shape without even creasing. His neighbours, as surprised as Brazel is, suggest that he take the debris to Roswell and show it to Sheriff Wilcox. The next morning, Sunday the 6th of July 1947, Brazel gets into his car and drives to Roswell, about 75 miles from his ranch. He stops at the sheriff's office and shows him the material taken from the large amount of debris found on his ranch. The sheriff takes a look at the material and listens to the rancher's story. He compares his words with the archaeologist's student's phone call the day before and concludes that the two events could be connected or even refer to the same incident. Maybe a small plane could have crashed. Due to the unusual nature of the material Brazel brought him, Wilcox contacts the RAAF authorities. Colonel William Blanchard, commander of the 509th Bomb Wing, takes charge of the matter. He orders Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer, to go to Roswell to investigate. Marcel interviews Brazel, examines the pieces of material the man had brought with him, and decides he'd better visit and examine the ranch himself. Brazel accepts without reservation and accompanies the officer to his ranch. Once reaching their destination, Marcel realizes that Brazel was telling the truth. Numerous pieces of unusual debris are indeed scattered on his land. The largest piece is about 4 feet long, 3 feet wide and 1 foot thick, but, more importantly, it is as light as a feather. Judging by the amount and type of debris, Marcel is convinced it is the remains of the fuselage of an aircraft that fell from its main body while in flight. Furthermore, given the short distance between the ranch and the location of the alleged impact, the strange object recovered under the eyes of firefighter Dwyer must be the main body of an aircraft. Therefore, an inevitable question arises. What kind of aircraft? Could it be military? Undoubtedly, this is not one of the military aircraft available to the RAAF. In fact, the remains examined show peculiarities and signs non-attributable to the aircraft used by the Army. Some of the remains are as thin as newspaper but incredibly strong, and the plastic-like beams have some symbols depicted on them. Symbols very similar to the hieroglyphic writing of our ancestors. Could they be symbols belonging to an extraterrestrial civilization? Unanswered questions and nagging doubts begin to fill Marcel's mind. The officer spends the night in a sleeping bag near the field with the debris, and as the sun rises, he climbs aboard his military-equipped Dodge Jeep carryall, loads some of the debris onto it, and returns to the RAAF base. Marcel reports to Colonel Blanchard not only what he saw, but also shows him the materials taken from Brazel's ranch and gives him his personal assumptions. Blanchard, convinced that he has something very unusual in his possession and almost certainly connected in some way to the previously found object, alerts his superiors at headquarters. And not just that, Colonel Blanchard personally contacts the head of the RAAF Public Information Office, Walter Haut, and orders him to issue a sensational press release which claims that the wreck of a flying saucer that crashed in Roswell County was recovered by military personnel from the base. The press release reads exactly as follows. The many rumours regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the Sheriff's Office of Chavez County. Action was immediately taken and the disc was picked up at the rancher's home. It was inspected at the Roswell Army Airfield and subsequently loaned by Major Marcel to higher headquarters. The local newspaper, the Roswell Daily Record, releases the full statement on its front page, causing scandal and agitation not only among Roswell citizens but also those of the surrounding areas and perhaps the entire nation. So much so that the next day the Air Force personally intervenes to calm the waters and categorically deny what had been stated just a few hours earlier. The newspapers now report that the aforementioned flying saucer is nothing more than a meteorological device, a so-called weather balloon. Senior military officials sent directly from Washington burst into the Roswell Daily Record offices retrieving all the original copies of the press release issued by the RAAF the previous day. Brazel, who in the meantime had recorded an interview for KGFL, the local Roswell radio station, is taken away by the military and placed in pre-trial detention. His ranch is cleaned up completely. Debris is collected and loaded onto trucks. His interview is deleted and no trace of it will remain. But why? What did the man say in that radio interview? Above all, what crime had the cattle farmer committed to be taken into custody by the United States Army? Is it perhaps a crime to witness a particularly unusual event? Or maybe Brazel had spoken too much and therefore needed to be silenced. Meanwhile, the top brass decide to load the debris found in the Brazel Ranch and the remains found on the first site, beyond the Capitan Mountains, onto two separate military flights. Both planes depart from the runways of the Roswell RAAF, but with two very different destinations. The first is headed for the Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, a strategic military base of the US Air Force. The second, instead, flies to Wright Field in Ohio, an installation where pilots were trained during the First World War, and which is now an operational base where flight tests and experiments in the military aeronautical field are conducted. Sergeant Robert Earl Smith, part of the 1st Air Transport Unit bound for the Texas base, is one of those in charge of loading the crates onto the aircraft. Smith reports that the loading operation is supervised by a number of people in civilian clothes, probably senior government officials. He, as well as the rest of the team, have been told that the crates come from a plane crash. This statement makes Smith suspicious. As far as he can remember, the remains of a crashed plane were never loaded onto military aircraft under armed and governmental escort. So, curious to find out more, during the loading operation and taking advantage of a moment of distraction by the guards, Sergeant Smith manages to pull a fragment, similar to aluminium foil, out of one of the crates. The man realizes that the material cannot be folded in any way. After crumpling it, it returns to its original shape. It is undoubtedly one of the remains found by McBrazel on his ranch. Without arousing further suspicion, Smith manages to slip the strange fragment into his pocket. Days go by. It is now July the 15th, 1947. McBrazel is finally released from military custody and returns home, welcomed with open arms by his wife and son Bill, who has returned to the ranch for the breeding season during his father's absence. McBrazel is extremely shaken. Bill peppers him with questions. He wants to know what happened, what they asked him, and if they tortured him. The man is adamant. He has taken an oath that he will never speak again about what he saw, let alone the content of the interrogations he underwent. The cover-up operation by the US Air Force appears to have worked. By now, most of the world has forgotten that, presumably, a flying saucer arrived on the Earth from an extraterrestrial planet and crashed onto it. The whole story now seems destined for oblivion, but on the fateful night of July the 3rd, during that violent storm in Roswell County, there is another man who witnessed the crash of a mysterious flying object. Dr. Lincoln LaPaz. Lincoln LaPaz is an astronomer defined by insiders as a pioneer in the study of meteors. He was born in Wichita, Kansas on February 12, 1897. He studied mathematics at Fairmont College and graduated with honors in 1920. He then obtained a scholarship from the prestigious Harvard University and wrote a thesis on the calculus of variations. During the Second World War, he served as a technical director at the New Mexico Proving Ground, a site where top-secret military aircraft equipment shells were tested. During his service, LaPaz shifted his interests to ballistics, and from there to the study of meteorites. He published hundreds of books and volumes, dedicating a whole life to the study of astronomy and, as mentioned, meteorites. Back on that fateful night of July the 3rd, 1947, LaPaz was driving with his wife and children near Fort Sumner, New Mexico, about 80 miles away from Roswell. The journey by car was proceeding smoothly when, suddenly, LaPaz notices a strange elliptical-shaped object flying through the sky. The object was very bright and followed strange, unpredictable trajectories. It swayed back and forth. Its brightness was stronger than that of the planet Jupiter, and its nature was completely unknown to the astronomer. The object then disappeared behind the Capitan Mountains, causing its tracks to be lost. LaPaz is convinced that the aircraft, given its illogical trajectory, crashed just beyond those peaks. Therefore, 2 months later, in September 1947, he takes advantage of the top-secret authorization he earned during the Second World War and starts important research to understand what that strange and luminous flying object was. The task of LaPaz is to determine the speed and trajectory of the aircraft in order to try to identify as closely as possible where it impacted the ground. There are two problems for the astronomer. Firstly, LaPaz, who, as mentioned, is a pioneer in the study of meteors, is not very familiar with the study of the flight paths of planes or aircraft. Second, the recovery teams sent by Washington to eliminate any evidence of the accident did their job so well that no trace of the crash remained, neither on the Brazel Ranch nor on the alleged impact site. Despite these obstacles, LaPaz is determined to uncover the truth and devises a somewhat singular but probably brilliant plan. The astronomer hires a biological researcher whose name is unknown. We only know that he had a long working relationship with a certain Albert Einstein. And, armed with a metal detector, they head towards Roswell County, near the probable area of the crash. The idea is that the biologist will determine if and where the vegetation along the affected area has grown abnormally or has been removed and replanted. It is a long and expensive job. The metal detector, on the other hand, is used to reveal the possible presence of material under the Earth's surface. They travel several miles in either direction from the determined trajectory until they discover an unknown and still pristine spot about 5 miles away from Brazel's ranch. Here, LaPaz and the biologist note how the ground seems to have somehow crystallized. That is, the upper part of the sand and gravel have a very light but still visible shade of blue. The hue is caused by what appears to be a transparent patina, as if it had undergone a veneer or a blue spray had been sprayed on the surface of the ground. Furthermore, the plants and shrubs that grow around the area seem burnt, or are more or less trying to return to a stage of natural growth after being damaged. La Paz speculates that the aircraft made a cold landing without power and then tried to take off again, but ended up losing parts on the Brazel Ranch just a few miles away and finally crashed beyond the Capitan Mountains. The astronomer finds no evidence that can be traced back to an aircraft of alien or otherwise extraterrestrial origin. However, La Paz feels he still has some doubts to resolve. In the days that follow, La Paz interviews a fairly large number of people, many of them Spanish-speaking, in and around the town of Roswell, especially anyone he encounters along the suspected flight path of the mysterious object. However, he discovers that most of the people interviewed appear intimidated or otherwise reluctant to answer. Nonetheless, La Paz's tenacity in seeking the truth about what happened at all costs finally pays off. Inspecting the places along the trajectory of the aircraft under study, he naturally comes across Brazel's ranch. As mentioned, the man is extremely reluctant and refuses to provide any details on what he has seen, nor about everything that has happened in the previous months. La Paz gives up in the face of the man's obstinacy and starts to leave, when, now well away from the house, he is joined by Bill, Mac Brazel's son, riding his horse. He signals to La Paz to get on the horse with him, and he takes him to a shed not far from the impact area of the pile of debris. Bill opens the shed, rummages through the various objects, and, from under a thick dark tarpaulin, pulls out a piece of the plastic-like beams recovered on the day of the incident by his father, the ones with the hieroglyphic symbols on them. La Paz is surprised and fascinated by these curious symbols. Bill tells him that he found the piece, almost hidden underground, a few weeks after the military arrived, and kept it in the hope, one day, of delivering it into the hands of someone who could finally discover the truth. The astronomer takes charge of both Bill Brazel's requests and hopes, and takes the object away with him. Before returning to the university to examine it, La Paz's interviews continue. He goes to the home of Walter Haut, the lieutenant in charge of the Public Information Office of the RAAF, the man responsible for the famous press release on the 8th of July 1947. Lieutenant Haut speaks freely and declares, in essence, that the first version published in the communiqué was truthful about the facts. In particular, he states that, "I am convinced that what I personally observed was a type of spaceship and its crew from outer space." La Paz presses on, and Lieutenant Haut goes into specifics. These are his words. On the 8th of July 1947, following the press release given in the afternoon, I was taken to a hangar at the RAAF base by Colonel Blanchard. Here I saw an egg-shaped spaceship, about 4.5 meters long, together with several small bodies, about 1 meter high, with large heads. I was sure the bodies were aliens, and that they were on the spacecraft that crashed in Roswell in 2 different areas. One, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell, Brazel's ranch, while the other was about 40 miles north of the city, where the main spaceship and, in fact, the bodies were found. During the meeting that morning that I attended, the officers of the base were informed of the strange debris found on the 2 sites, which nobody could identify. Then there was a discussion about what was to be told to the public. A general, sent directly from the Pentagon, arrived, General Ramey, who then joined the meeting. General Ramey suggested communicating only the most distant debris field to public opinion, that of the Brazel Ranch, as a diversion, to distract attention from the most important area, the one with the bodies and the main part of the spacecraft. The press release that was issued a few hours later, therefore, only described the first debris zone in general terms, saying that the United States Army Air Forces had come into possession of a flying saucer with the collaboration of a local rancher, and it had been transferred to the upper floors after being examined at the base. It was this definition of flying saucer that created an unexpected general turmoil in public opinion. So the following day, General Ramey intervened and rectified the press release by declaring that flying saucer meant a simple weather balloon. In conclusion, Haut suggests another person for La Paz to talk to, who is in possession, he says, of a very strange material, Sergeant Robert Earl Smith. The astronomer doesn't waste any time and goes straight to the sergeant. The man welcomes him and, just like Haut, speaks without hesitation. He retrieves a small wooden box, similar to a cigar box, in the corner of the attic and hands it to La Paz. He opens it and finds a piece of material similar to a folded aluminium sheet, the size of a handkerchief. Unbeknownst to his colleagues and his superiors, Sergeant Smith had found and slipped the piece of material into his pocket, to have it later analysed by someone more experienced on the subject than he was. La Paz is visibly surprised by this revelation and the confidence placed in him by the sergeant. He wastes no time and returns to the university to analyse the materials in his possession. In order to analyse the strange aluminium foil, La Paz calls to his aid Colonel Philip J. Corso, a military expert and head of some of the Pentagon's most secret weapons projects. The colonel scrutinises the mysterious object and realises that he is facing something extraordinary. The sheet has the malleability of fabric, but the strength and resistance of metal. Corso reveals to La Paz that there is no such thing in the Pentagon, not even in their bucket list. "Try to tear it," the colonel says. The astronomer first pulls it gently, then with all his strength, but without results. "See if you can cut it," Corso continues. La Paz tries with a pair of scissors, then even with garden cutters using both hands. But the sheet suffers no damage. In fact, immediately after the stresses it is subjected to, the material always returns to its original shape. The colonel concludes with absolute certainty that the object has a unique, amorphous atomic structure. In fact, on Earth, there are no materials nor metals with a similar atomic structure. All of the evidence seems to lead in a single, surprising direction. Yet, still to be analysed, were the strange symbols on the plastic-like beams found on the Brazil ranch, and hidden from the military by the rancher's son, Bill. In this case, La Paz hires a former professor of literature at the University of Berkeley, California, to analyse the writing. The symbols are of a metallic purplish hue. Right from the start, the professor senses that somehow the purpose of these symbols is of a communicative type, that is, a sort of attempt at communication between foreign peoples. He undoubtedly excludes, given the complexity and volume of information contained in the glyphs, that they could be counterfeit or were a product of Bill Brazil's imagination, and instead strongly supports their authenticity. Not only that, Lapaz, who has read and studied many books on quantum physics, identifies in the glyphs characteristics that are very similar to magnetic fields. One of these volumes also includes technical illustrations that reflect the various shapes taken by electrons. Lapaz, looking closely at these illustrations, notices a striking similarity between these and the Roswell glyphs. By rearranging the 10 symbols drawn on the beams from the Brazier Ranch and numbering them from 1 to 10 from left to right, we can see the correlation between these and the electron clouds. The symbols 1, 4 and 5 of the first Roswell beams are strikingly similar to the L1 and M1 electron cloud figures as shown. Symbol number 8 is exactly the same as L2. While not entirely identical, symbols 3 and 6 bear a distinct resemblance to L3. Electron clouds, by their nature, are always in motion, and for each movement they have a different state and a different shape. Therefore, for Lapaz, it is highly likely that the glyphs refer to electromagnetic fields used in the propulsion, navigation and driving system, based on their correspondence with each specific transient state of the electron cloud. Not only that, given the complexity of the symbols, their author must in some way know how to design, build and consequently think at the subatomic level, drawing on the charge of a particle of the atom, the electron, using this to perform motion. A course could even be set simply by drawing the various shapes that the electron cloud will take every time it has to veer, or go straight, or cross the atmosphere. And since this subatomic knowledge is not inherent to human beings, Lapaz and the old professor conclude that it can only be a writing from another planet, from extremely intelligent extraterrestrial life forms. The aircraft that crashed on the ground of Roswell on the night of the 3rd of July 1947 was following a route drawn before departure through the use of these symbols, and, probably due to an error in reading the glyphs or even in their writing, the aircraft lost control and crashed to the ground as a result. But the symbols present on the beams of the aircraft do not indicate a route, because they seem to represent all the stages and forms that the electron cloud can take. So, what are these symbols for? La Paz and the old professor are unable to give us a coherent explanation. However, we can try. Because about 25 years after La Paz's work, on March 2, 1972, on board an Atlas Centaur rocket launched from Cape Kennedy, the Pioneer 10 probe was sent on a mission into space. Pioneer 10 is an unmanned probe intended for the exploration of the planets of the solar system, and in particular directed towards Jupiter. The probe has on board a gold plate with a drawing of a man and a woman, together with information on the origins of man and the creators of the probe itself, intended for any extraterrestrial entity that eventually finds it one day. So, returning to Dr. Lincoln La Paz's analysis of the glyphs present on the vehicle that crashed in Roswell on the night of July 3, 1947, we can certainly assume that the intentions of those who sent this aircraft to Earth are the same as those who launched the Pioneer 10 25 years later. That is, the communication and mutual knowledge of the peoples who inhabit different planets. An attempt at contact between extraterrestrial peoples. However, La Paz and the old professor's analysis found no scientific basis. Just as deciphering the Egyptian hieroglyphs has required centuries and centuries of in-depth study, in the same way it will probably take some time before the scientific community can give an exact and irrefutable explanation of those symbols. In 1978, Stanton T. Friedman, ufologist and former nuclear physics researcher, interviewed Jesse Marcel, the major who in 1947 was photographed with the remains of the weather balloon and who, together with General Roger Ramey, claimed that it was this what crashed in Roswell. In the interview, the major stated that the Air Force version was a false intention, was a false statement, intended to cover up the truth and hide what really crashed in New Mexico in July of 1947. The case rekindled interest in the Roswell incident and brought it under global media attention. So much so that on February 15, 1994, in response to a parliamentary inquiry into the Roswell case, the Air Force opened an internal investigation aimed at clarifying the matter once and for all. Thus, a first official report was written and published, the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, in 1995, and a second and final report in 1997. As stated by these reports, it was not a weather balloon that crashed, but a module belonging to the Mogul project, a top-secret operation of the United States Air Force, dedicated to monitoring the activities of the Soviet Union and its possible progress in the development of atomic bombs. The moguls consisted of a row of weather balloons, followed by a large tail made up of a dozen radar reflectors. A mogul measured about 100 meters long, and the crash of one of them could have created fields of debris in a more or less extensive area. Evidence of this project dates back to before 1947. It was initially conceived by the geophysicist Morris Ewing, as demonstrated in a memo sent to General Carl A. Spaatz, commander of the Army Air Forces, where he suggested a way to detect possible Soviet atomic tests. Ewing had in fact discovered that at an altitude of 14,000 meters there was an acoustic channel in which the explosions caused by Soviet atomic tests could be heard. At the time, however, no aircraft was able to reach these altitudes, and therefore it was decided to use specific probes. For the realization of these probes, the Air Force entered into contact with New York University, which organized the so-called Balloon Group, directed by Alfistan Spilhaus. After the first test launches carried out between April and May in 1947 from the Lee University football field in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, it was decided to move the launch site to the Alamogordo Air Base in New Mexico. The module that crashed between the 2nd and 3rd of July 1947 in Roswell County was the Mogul belonging to Flight 4. This would explain the unusual trajectories detected that night by the RAAF radars. However, the report does not clear up some of the doubts related, above all, to Dr. La Paz's analysis of the remains found in the debris field of the Brazel Ranch. In particular, the mysteries connected to the strange aluminium sheet made of a malleable material like fabric, but more resistant than metal, remain unsolved, as well as the glyphs present on the plastic-like beams, very similar to the shapes assumed by electron clouds. In this regard, browsing the Federal Bureau of Investigation website, interesting details emerge on the true nature of the object found. Recently, in fact, the FBI has unveiled in its online archive an enormous amount of official documentation relating to the UFO phenomenon, in which it has been directly or indirectly involved. In the case of the Roswell incident, there is a document forwarded by the Federal Bureau office in Dallas to the director of the Cincinnati department, the subject of which leaves no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Flying disc, information concerning. We report here in full the contents of the telegram dated the 6th of July 1947, which, as you can see, contains some words which were subsequently eliminated for reasons unfortunately unknown to us, and which, judging from the context, very probably refer to a government office or official. Headquarters, 8th Air Force. Redacted, telephonically advised this office that an object purporting to be a flying disc was recovered near Roswell, New Mexico, this date. The disc is hexagonal in shape and was suspended from a balloon by a cable, which balloon was approximately 20 feet in diameter. Redacted, further advised that the object found resembles a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector, but that telephonic conversation between their office and Wright Field had not borne out this belief. Disc and balloon being transported to Wright Field by special plane for examination of information provided this office because of national interest in case and fact the National Broadcasting Company, Associated Press and others attempting to break story of location of disc today. Redacted, advised, would request Wright Field to advise Cincinnati office results of examination. No further investigation being conducted. As can easily be seen, already in 1947, a very short time after the discovery of the remains of the mysterious object, even the FBI expressed strong doubts about the veracity of the theory according to which the object is nothing more than a weather balloon. Therefore, the final 1997 investigation only fuels further the mystery of the Roswell crash. One of the many unsolved mysteries related to UFOs that, rather than giving answers, trigger a series of questions, the most important of which, perhaps, remains: are we really alone in the universe?